Hello and good afternoon. I am pleased to welcome you present here in person and those online with the Sustainability of Canadian Agriculture Conference to the third annual Ted Poyser Lecture in Soil Science. My name is Mario Tenuta and I am the acting head of the Department of Soil Science. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original soils of the Anishinabeg, Ininawuk, Ansununnuwuk, Dakota Yate, and Dene peoples, and also on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these soils and waters. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Before we welcome this year's Ted Poyser lecturer, I would like to acknowledge my fellow members of the Poyser Lecture Committee, Chair Tim Sopak over here, Samantha Gurman. Samantha, I saw you earlier. There's Samantha. Laura Rance Unger of Glacial Media, and Crystal Jorgensen of the Communication Coordinator of the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, and Crystal is somewhere there. I'd like to call upon Mr. Sopak to speak on behalf of the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy and provide some background on the Poyser lectureship. Tim?
Thank you, Mario. Conference and lecture attendees, Dr. Whalen. I'd like to start first by saying that we have two members of Ted Poyser's family in the audience with us today. Liz Knight, daughter of Ted and Alice Poyser, who lives in Vancouver, and she's here with her husband, Phil. And Elliot Sims, a grandnephew whose family continues to farm in the original Poyser homestead. Folks, just quickly stand up. About 4 years ago, I retired from the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, which, by the way, is celebrating its 4th decade of conservation action this year. You might find it curious that a habitat conservation organization is supporting the annual Ted Poyser Lecture in Soil Health, in partnership with the Department of Soil Science and the University of Manitoba. And it's really because Ted played a foundational role in helping the Conservancy to become Manitoba's largest habitat conservation organization today. And even at the Conservancy, Ted's counsel always included the simple statement, it all begins with the soil. To help understand what drove him, I think it's important to start with the fact that Ted grew up on a farm near McGregor in the dirty 30s. Now, Mississippi Sands, I believe, for all you soils geeks, is that right? Yeah. He took a degree in agriculture and then a master's degree in soil science under Dr. Joe Ellis, whose name is attached to the soil science building here on campus. His career started from the ground level, literally. He worked on the provincial soil survey for a number of years. From there, he worked his way into leading some of the largest land use and conservation initiatives in the province. Some of the programs that he significantly influenced included the Canada-Manitoba Crop Insurance Program, the Canada Land Inventory, a major agriculture and rural development initiative in the Interlake region, and he worked on land assembly for some of the largest provincial parks and wildlife management areas in southern Manitoba. Along the way, researchers, middle managers, senior managers, and cabinet ministers of all political stripes sought out his views. And you might ask yourself, why? Soils guy, why would they? Well, it's because he excelled at helping people to see the world more broadly. He did it in a way that like nobody else I knew. He was relentless in his efforts to build bridges where only silos existed. From the 1960s and on into the 2000s, many people who became leaders in agriculture, in agricultural research, in government policy, and program planning will tell you that Ted was one of their most important mentors. The Ted Poyser Plant Ideas Endowment Fund was built with contributions that came from the Conservancy, Ted's family, watershed districts, the Manitoba Soil Science Society, and many of his former colleagues. The name expresses really what Ted did best, stimulating people to think in new ways. I'm also pleased to say that Liz Knight came up with the name for that. You may not remember that, but I do. I just want to close by, as Mario said, to thank the members of the committee that helped to put this event together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Now for some instructions on how our online audience can ask questions during the the question and answer session following the lecture. If you're watching on the Sustainability of Canadian Conference platform, just enter your questions into the Q&A panel. If you are watching us today on YouTube, through the faculty site, please use the chat to submit questions. And at the end of the talk, Crystal will field those questions and present them. And now I would like to introduce the 2026 Ted Poyser Lecturer in Soil Health, Dr. Joanne Whalen. Dr. Whalen is a James McGill Professor in the Department of Natural Resources Sciences at McGill University, and an affiliate professor and chair of soil science in the Center for Sustainable Soil Sciences at the Mohammed VI Polytechnique University in Ben Guerir, Morocco. Dr. Whalen received a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from Nova Scotia Agricultural College and Master of Science from McGill University and a PhD from Ohio State University. She then worked as a research scientist for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at Lethbridge, Alberta, prior to joining the faculty at McGill in 2000. Her research group is optimizing management practices and agricultural systems on soils with various constraints to simultaneously assure food production, farmers' livelihoods, and decarbonized agribusinesses. They study soil health as a foundational science that integrates functions from soil physics, chemistry, biology, and biochemistry to support life. The soil-centric approach holds that every square meter of well-managed soil supports resilient crops for the global agri-food system. A highly cited author with over 290 peer-reviewed publications, she has received numerous awards for contributions to research, including President of the American Society of Agronomy, James McGill Professor, Fellow of the Canadian Soil Science Society, Fellow of the Soil Science Society of America, and President of the Canadian Society of Soil Science. Please join in welcoming Dr. Whalen as the 2026 Ted Poyser in Soil Health. Joanne?
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much to the committee. It's a real honor to be here in Winnipeg as the speaker for this year's Poyser Lecture. And I'm going to take you away from cold Winnipeg, and I'm going to transport you to another world, across the ocean, and into Africa. And so the lecture today will be on the topic of soil health for monitoring agronomic gains, perspectives from West Africa and the Sahel. We are dealing, of course, with a grand challenge, which is how are we going to actually sustain the food production and the food security for the world's growing population, respecting the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN. We have a climate that is warming. And if we see Africa in these pictures, we will notice that the projections are for at least a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, meaning that it's going to be a lot warmer. It might be warming as fast as 0.3 degrees Celsius per year for the next decade. The rainfall also is more erratic. In fact, if we look through a historical view of the rainfall data for the whole climate of Africa, we see that the annual rainfall has been less and less in recent years. In fact, The drying of Africa started back in the late 1960s and has continued up until the mid-2005 with really no tremendous recovery in rainfall. We did have a very unusual year in North Africa this year in which the country has turned green, suggesting a resilience, but it has been after 7 years of extreme drought. So this is the conditions that is trying to be supporting farming in this area. So for Africa and the African continent, the greatest problems are water issues, either relating to too much and flooding or too little and drought, as well as the temperature increase and the general change in the climatic patterns. So these are the environmental conditions that are going to have a very great impact on the food security in Africa. Soil is a way to buffer some of the climatic change, and I refer you to this nice position paper published by Soil Security about 2 years ago, in which the WAC, which is the World Organization for Water and Soil Conservation, as well as the IUSS, the International Union of Soil Science, have positioned soils as being a regulator of climate. And in the paper, they specifically said and emphasized the importance of the soil management and conservation as being vital to the integrity of civilizations and their longevity as well. It is also mentioned there that under the current climate change, there is a close relationship between the climatic factors and the soil performance, but the soil also influences the climate, thus making it a climate regulator. And I think we understand this, and we have noticed this when we look at the simple function of soil as a carbon sink. We know very well that CO2 from the atmosphere gets fixed by photosynthesis into plants, and then through root exudation and the biomass integration of litter and roots into the soil and their decomposition, they do get stabilized as a portion of the soil organic matter, part of it being the living soil food that is respired back to the atmosphere. But the net effect of most soils is, under non-disturbed conditions, to serve as a sink of carbon and to store additional carbon. The amount of carbon stored in soils is quite substantial, as you can see from the numbers given there. But let me give you another figure which emphasizes it much more readily, showing that worldwide, when you look at any particular ecosystem in the world, most of the carbon is in the soil. And on a global basis, 1/3 of the circulating carbon is in plants and 2/3 of it is in the soil, reminding us of the importance of soil. The text that I shared with you also refers to a vision of soil as a natural system with socioeconomic benefits and ecological functions that mentions things like the European Green Deal and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as initiatives of importance for the soil and the land use issues. So it takes us to the concept of a soil health being much more than just measurements of the soil health being a living soil that supports life and helps us to achieve our socioeconomic goals and functions in an ecological context. And this may also lead us to a notion of resilience, which was the topic of a recent conference that was hosted by the Soil and Water Conservation Organization, the WASWAC organization. In that conference that they had, which was held in Rabat, Morocco in September of 2025, one of the things that you will note is, in addition to the conference program, they had a very specific training program for the youth. And this is a feature that we see very, very often in conferences in Africa. And I will show you clearly why this is such an emphasis. Going to our case study, we are now transporting you far across the ocean, away from cold Winnipeg, into a more steamy and tropical area. Actually, I was in Ibadan, Nigeria last week. The daily temperature was 35 degrees Celsius. I felt very warm. I came to Winnipeg. I felt much cooler. So we transport you to a warm tropical area, but actually we shouldn't be really deceived by this area as being uniform. In fact, there's a great deal of heterogeneity because at the top, when we go to Mauritania, Mali, and Niger, they are actually into the Sahel, which is a desert area. So they are a lot drier. And as we go to the farther south, we get into more of the warm tropical areas. But I can say that in each and every one of these countries, there is a certain heterogeneity. So we are talking about a region that is definitely a lot warmer than here. It is in the, in the subtropical area, but it ranges from quite dry to very wet. In this area, the population is largely smallholder farmers. And so we see a very typical farm in the picture in which the fields can be managed by hand with really very little machinery or sometimes none at all. There's a lot of animals integrated into the farms, and there may be also agroforestry, such as this young lady here with a cocoa plantation. 80% of the cultivated cropland is cultivated by smallholders, meaning they own 1 or 2 or 3 hectares of land, and smallholder farming accounts for about 42% of all the employment. So many people are employed on these farms, and they produce 70% of the food that Africans eat. So we have this group of people, in fact, about over 30 million people who are doing the farming to feed Africa. It's quite incredible. Again, let's look into this West Africa area and start to understand something about the populations and the dynamics. You will see all of the countries starting from Mauritania all the way down to Nigeria. And you will notice that there's a great diversity in the legend there. It gives a great diversity of the ecotypes and the agricultural conditions for growing food, meaning there's a huge diversity of different types of foods that are grown. So whereas we might have a focus on some major crops, we might think, in Manitoba, we have like potato production. There's a little bit of corn, there's wheat, canola, there's other small cereals. We have a relatively limited selection of crops that we manage. In Africa, it's quite a different scenario in which there are many, many more crops, and many crops that they call forgotten crops because there hasn't been any breeding efforts and there hasn't been any particular development of those crops. The traditional ones, the ones that are in grandmother's, special dish, are quite unique. We notice also here some differences in climatic conditions, but let me take you to the populations of these countries. And you will notice that in stark contrast to the population demographics we're used to in North America, most of the population is very young. They are under 35 years of age. That is the largest bulge of the population. And as we get this interesting demographic also, we find that the young people are perhaps less willing than their parents to stay as smallholder farmers. They would like to, go and become YouTube influencers or any other thing. And so we notice also a decline in the number of people who are doing farming operations. Throughout this whole region, again, here's a map of pH for the region, and we can see great variation in the pH levels, all the way from quite acidic soils to absolutely alkaline soils, variable soils, agroclimatic conditions, dietary regimes, markets, and even agricultural policies. It's very fragmented in the area. And so this is the condition and the context that we're trying to work in. Let's just look a little bit at how crops grow in this area. And this is a world map, 2024. This is wheat yield. I chose wheat simply because it's grown all over the place, and including in West Africa and the Sahel. And we, I think, understand how wheat's supposed to grow and what kind of yields you can get. But going into this region, look at the color chart on the bottom versus the colors that we see. We are noticing countries that are producing 1 ton per hectare, 2 tons per hectare, maybe as much as 3 or maybe edging into 4, but they're not very productive. And then of course there is a whole lot of countries that say XXX, no data. Huh? No data? How can you have no data? I mean, don't we know this? In Africa, we don't know what the data is. It's not properly collected. We're lacking information. Here's the wheat yield gap. Let's look into the same countries. This is even worse. We don't know what the potential yield could be in these countries. We are lacking data. So one of our big problems, when I told the title of my talk and I said soil health connection to agronomic gain, what we've discovered is that we don't even have the baseline data for most of West Africa. So one of the functions that I've had in the research we've been doing in Africa is actually to create surveys and checklists, which are going to be given to the in-country agronomists, and they go to the field and they collect the data, and we start to create a database. It's very data poor. And of course, they don't have yield monitors on combines. They're not farming land that's large enough to have a combine. They don't have yield monitors. They don't even take basic measurements. So we're starting in a very data poor environment, which is a interesting and challenge. I mentioned the 33 million small scale farmers that are producing 70% of Africa's food supply. And they are doing it under conditions that none of us in Canada would find acceptable. They don't have access to good seed varieties. The tools are very hand-driven and not much mechanization. And even training is quite poor. The FAO had suggested that you should have a ratio of extension workers to farmers of about 1 to 200 or maybe 1 to 400. So meaning you have one extension worker that can service a couple hundred or maybe up to 400 farmers. But the reality is across Africa, you might have one extension worker per 2,000 farmers. In some places, one extension worker per 10,000 farmers. So there's a huge gap in translating, even if the extension workers have the knowledge, in getting it out to the farming community. So this is another big barrier to efficient farming systems, to preserving the soil health, to using fertilizers, to having improved yield, to food security. So there's just so many things missing that you'd say, we can't do anything, except we could. And this is where the Regional Hub for Fertilizer and Soil Health has come in. You've seen these little icons on the bottom of my presentation. They've been popping up all along. We know that agronomic gain depends on fertilizer, and it also depends on good, healthy soil. And this was recognized in Africa as far back as 2006. There was a declaration at Abuja in 2006 in which the Africa Fertilizer Summit was held, and they said, we need to do something. We need to make an effort. After a number of additional years, the African Union got ahead and they made an additional declaration at Lomé, and they said, okay, you know, nothing has moved very much in the past almost 20 years. We are really going to do something now. And at Nairobi, they came with an additional declaration and they said, okay, we've talked with the World Bank and we figured it out, and they are going to support us, and we are going to go ahead and do it. So sometimes even if a declaration is made, it may take almost 20 years to get things in motion. So that's the kind of timeframes we're dealing with in Africa. But they said, we cannot wait any longer. The population is increasing. We have all these young people. We need to feed everyone. People don't want to farm. What are we going to do? So something has to be done. From Abuja to Nairobi, finally, a group of very dedicated people led by the CGIR from IITA got together. We can see that this new institute called the Regional Hub for Fertilizer and Soil Health for West Africa and the Sahel has been opened. If you look carefully, you will see me in the back row in that picture. I was there at the signing event in which all the diplomats and the heads came and put it together. But what it took is probably 3 prior years of people talking together, of partners getting together and determining that they, in fact, would cooperate. And so all the partners came together and were given roles in this consortium. And so we have IITA taking their role. It comprises all of the CG power behind them that can be put into force for this. OCP Africa, with their big push to move out and expand their operations into Africa, was the business partner. And then we had APNI, which is the African Plant Nutrition Institute, which offers services in the fertilizer recommendation field. They are the offspring of IPNI, which you may recognize for our nutrient stewardship. Yeah. So they're like the baby of them for the African continent. UM6P are there to offer capacity building support on the training and education. IFDC, which is the fertilizer technology guys from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, are also in Africa. And also we have ISRIC, which are the soil mapping group from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. The World Bank has very graciously supported this program, and also ACRA, as well as OCP Africa as our business partner. So we have the financial support to get going. Because why? Because we need to produce more food, more animal feed, more fuel, and more fiber for all the people living in these areas. We need to make sure that we do this while preserving the ecosystem services, by preserving the biodiversity and by keeping the soils healthy. And we need to have systems that are resilient to shocks. We don't want to import technologies from other places that won't be appropriate, that will actually cause more problems. We need to work with the natural systems as they are and develop them. And so over the last 20 years, since Abuja 2006, we have noticed an increase in the number of associations put together to support fertilizer production and fertilizer distribution. This, in fact, was a huge problem. If you went back 20 years ago, even if you were in a place and you wanted to purchase fertilizer, you couldn't find it. Or you could find a bag and it is one formulation. And so you have to try to manage your fertilizer recommendations with a single, 20-20-20 or a 10-10-10 or a 12-12-12. You've got to try to manage it with very limited resources. But luckily, the West Africa Fertilizer Association had got going, and we worked with them with training programs to help them understand things from the soil perspective as well, because they are more on the commercial and marketing and distribution side. The fertilizer use has increased in the last 20 years, but the efficiency still remain low. And why? Think of the pH map. If you have a very low pH or a very high pH, doesn't matter how much fertilizer you put, you have a liming constraint, you have a pH imbalance, which impacts the fertilizer use efficiency. So sometimes there are things that have to be fixed before fertilizer will work to its capacity. Soil organic matter levels in some other places are extremely low, and fertilizers don't work very well in the low organic matter soils. I'm not talking low like you think in Manitoba. Oh, it's 3%, pretty low. No, I'm talking 0.3%. I'm talking really low. So the appropriate technologies have to be brought into place to meet the production objectives. And so some of the tools that are being developed are digital tools and our decision support tools. One tool is called AgWise. This is a forecasting model for the agronomic practices. It helps people optimize their planting date and their cultivar selection. AgWise is now being rolled out, and it's being kind of bundled on top of the soil fertility recommendations and the soil maps. So we're trying to we got various tools around, and we're trying to put them together. So this notion that we're working on is what we call integrated soil fertility management. You may be thinking about it of, oh yeah, integrated nutrient management, make sure you value all your nutrients, the ones from the green manure crops, the organic manures, and all the different fertilizing power that you get from different residues and so on. But integrated soil fertility management is even a broader concept than that. And in the African context, what it means is put together all the pieces of the puzzle. Diagnose what is the constraint in your farm. Picks the most limiting factors, such as the pH or such as the organic matter first. Then layer on your fertilizer program with an adaptive soil management that makes sense for your region. Adapt the appropriate crop varieties that will use those nutrients more efficiently and build awareness. But in addition, there's a whole other part to it as well. The policies. We need agricultural policy that supports the deployment of these technologies and the knowledge sharing. As well, for farms to produce materials, they need a market. And so you need market-driven demand normally, as well as policies that will assure that the country has the right farm inputs and the strategic policy adjustment. But let me speak to the access to the inputs. You know, we had a case from Liberia in which the soil pH was the big problem. There was no agricultural lime in the country. Why? Because nobody had told the Minister of Agriculture, you need to order it and bring it into the country. So they were using calcium hydroxide, which was used as like whitewash in paint as a liming amendment. So it was really quite remarkable. It seemed to work, but it's not long lasting and it's not really suitable or appropriate. But you know, you do what you can do in such a situation. So, you know, this soil health concept, it still remains complex. Sometimes people get bogged down in what are the key performance indicators? What do we need to measure? What constitutes soil health? And some of those indicators that we typically use of soil health are very slow to change. Soil organic carbon, for instance, does not get adjusted very quickly. So when you don't have a visible change in the soil health that people can see within a year or two, sometimes they get frustrated and they lose their motivation. And so incentives are needed to keep farmers investing in their soil health. And this is another sort of policy strategy in which you can assess that farmers are adopting certain practices and you can reward them through various means to keep doing those practices. Policy frameworks, unfortunately, up to this point in Africa, have mostly ignored soil health. And so we are trying to build awareness and change that mindset. So the hub that we have talked to you about, what it does is it is a fully equipped unit that delivers tools, knowledge, and expertise. And so you can imagine the hub as acting like a toolbox. It's got a workshop with the personnel, with the technologies and the tools that can provide the technical assistance to the countries. But we cannot push it into the countries. Honestly, in Africa, this will never work. We cannot come with a top-down approach and say, here you go, here's everything, go do it. No, it's got to work the other way. In fact, the way that the whole program is funded is the funding does not come to us, it goes to the countries. And the countries are then told, you're to use the funding to figure out what services you need and ask for them. So when the country determines that they need a particular service, they call us and they say, can you give us advisory? Can you help us make a soil map? Can you provide us with the guidelines or the help to get the checklist? Can you help us? And we say, of course, we're here to help. That's what we're doing. So it's a real kind of service that we're attempting to do in response to real demands on the ground. So we started off this hub with a kickoff meeting back in June 2024 after signing all of the agreements. After all of the diplomats and the politicians went home and all the pictures were taken, we sequestered ourselves in a room and we got down to work. And we made a list of what we thought the functions were of this regional hub. Now, the details of this list are not so important right now, but it's just that we had to say, well, what do we think we can offer as services to the countries in this region? And so we came up with 12 things. We said, there's at least 12 things that we can offer as services. And so as the hub got operationalized, and we got in a director and we got some support people who are actually the resource people in the hub. I mean, my picture's not there because I'm kind of external. I'm in the consortium partners. I'm not actually in what we call the hub, which is based in Ibadan, Nigeria. So they coordinate with focal points in every country. So to make this work, what you need is the centralized hub that creates the toolkits and creates the services and the products. And you need somebody in the country to communicate in both directions, to say, what tools do we need? Also, what's the demand from the country? And then how do we get them delivered? So to move things back and forth. So there's 17 countries in West Africa in the Sahel, and we had focused on here about 11 countries as a beginning, because really 17 countries is too many. And also, due to some reasons that we had other partners that were really focusing a lot of attention of the Sahel countries, we decided to let them get started with the Sahel countries, and we would partner. We just signed an agreement with them last week, so we are partnering with them now. So believe it, there's a lot of people that are focused on making soil health a reality in Africa. The country meetings with all of the various partners and stakeholders were very productive. People from the hub went out to the countries. They met with the focal point. They got together with the ministries of agriculture. They spoke to the leads of extension services and the advisory services in the country. They also got in contact with some of the partners like in the fertilizer industry and other businesses, and they had productive discussions. The result of all these discussions was, you remember how many, I told you we had like 12 different functions we thought we could serve. Well, when they came back from all the different countries, they told us, we'd like 20 services, please. So the demand was even much more than we could have imagined. And those services are not just on the biophysical aspects. So soil information, knowledge management and sharing and agronomy is a lot of the things that we thought of at the beginning, but they said, we also need help for the workforce capacity development. We need policy support. We need the ministers in these countries to agree, oh yeah, I guess we need to order some, millions of tons of lime or something like that to come into the country. We hadn't thought about it before, because honestly, they didn't know. They didn't have the knowledge, and nobody had explained to them, like, actually one of your biggest constraints is the pH. It's hard to believe, but let me explain it in this way. In some of these countries, the geopolitical situation and the internal conflicts due to civil wars and other things had really interfered with communication and had really caused a fragmentation of knowledge. And so even people that knew things were not able to communicate it, and systems had broken down in some of these countries. And so one of the functions that we added also at the end was just an advocacy and awareness function. And so the hub is trying to do a lot of small videos, webinars, make a knowledge base, send out newsletters, just constantly remind people, hello, don't forget about fertilizer and soil health. These are things that we've got to keep at the top of our mind, because it's the foundation. It's the foundation of all of our economics, our smallholders, it's our food safety, it's our food security, it's our food production. So we got to keep it in mind. So we came up with more things, and let me just tell you in the last minutes that I have here, a couple of kind of success stories about the new soil maps that they've started to generate. So we kind of do everything in phases. The idea is we have to start rolling out materials. We cannot wait till we have the perfect soil map or the ideal or completely validated. We have to have tools that are like good to go, and then we keep improving on them. So here we noticed that, a digital map version 0 was made, and then a version 1 was made, and a version 2 is, rolling out. And so that's kind of how we're doing things. So we kind of get a quick scan, and then a better, and then a more in-depth and detailed as the information comes in. So here, for instance, is a version 1 map that will cover about 3.3 million hectares in Ghana, another one that covers about 2.5 million hectares in Senegal. So you can see they're not complete maps, but they're at least validated for more specific regions where we had enough soil data to do them. Here's another set of V2 maps in which more detailed information and sampling frameworks were set up, in which they could collect enough data to make a better and more precise map. The mapping work is extremely important to us, but the maps are not just a static thing. They are supposed to be part of a soil information system in which the soil map becomes the base for implementing liming programs, soil organic carbon improvement programs, fertilizer recommendation on a site-specific basis, recommendation maps or decision support. So the framework is to try to integrate these things together, the soils, the climate, and the agronomic recommendations that come from the AgWise platform as well. So that's how we're trying to envision it. For the user, it should be a dashboard with different options that can be used functionally as decision support. Another thing that was interesting and important was to get enough information to do fertilizer nutrient recommendations for specific crops and soil combinations in some of the prioritized target areas. We worked on prioritized target areas because if we can get those right, we can replicate it other places. We can have standard operating procedures that can be rolled out in other places. Some countries are not quite ready to do this yet, but if they see the good example of countries that are more advanced, then they can follow suit as they're ready, as the capacity is developed. And so, for instance, we started here with the crop and soil-specific fertilizer recommendations, version 1 based on AgWise framework, which was already in existence, focusing on some key crops that are staples, maize, rice, and cassava, and validating information that was already available for Mali, Ghana, and Nigeria, and using some AI tools to quickly get a fast scan and get things going. With a version 1 now going more in-depth and using actual field trials where we have nutrient emission trials, and those are being conducted in particular sets of countries, particularly some countries that have much poorer soil information like Togo, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And you might remember from your history lesson that these countries did have some internal conflicts which interfered and held them back from having the soil knowledge that other places had. So we would have these nutrient omission trials in which you have different sets of sustainable management practices together with various combinations of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sometimes with micronutrients included depending on the area, so that we can evaluate the yield gains. And for some places, finally get what the real optimal yield or real target yield is that you could actually achieve. So in some places, as you know, we don't know the achievable yield. So that needs to be assessed. We're also working to try to overcome the gap of not having extension services. Not enough. I mean, there are, but it's not enough for the number of farmers. And so we're trying to put knowledge into people's hands using a tool called ISDA Virtual Agronomist. Again, it's not going to be perfect for every farm, but it at least gets us into the right ballpark in which we can integrate now production objectives, soil health conditions, and climatic conditions for specific crops and engage with the farmers using an AI client. And so the farmer can kind of talk with the AI client, and it prompts them with certain questions, and then it gives them some recommendations. So this is, again, going to help those farmers that might not have access to any type of agronomic or extension service support to now have a tool which gives them a better approach to this. And so 70,000 farmers are now being targeted in Nigeria and Mali so that we can hopefully test it with them and then scale it out to a future-ready digital extension model, thus overcoming the gap until we get more extension agents and services actually trained up in the countries. The challenges and the lessons that we're learning as we go through this process. Of course, the main thing, I think you might have guessed it so far, is lack of data, the fragmented data system. Countries really vary across this whole region in their capacity to generate, to store, and to share, and even to manage the soil data and to use them for decision support. And another big problem is lack of laboratory services. So there are many labs that are not really compliant or functional at the appropriate level. And so they've been placed into kind of a network in which they're supposed to share information amongst each other and even start sending samples around for like quality control and quality assurance. So that's a big step forward. And then the solutions that are coming to these problems are the national soil information services that are supposed to be a kind of a repository for all the information that's known to make better decisions, and then this laboratory network that's been developed. Some more lessons that we learned is that from an operational perspective, coordinating at an entire regional basis, even though you look at it and you say, wow, 17 countries across a really wide climatic range and their different geographies and different governments and so on, but having a hub allows us to coordinate and to actually connect, and for countries to look at their neighbors and learn lessons from them and to share knowledge that before was blocked because there was a national boundary and you didn't look on the other side. So we're trying to break those boundaries down, and we're trying to make it smoother transitions. With the dedicated country technical support, we're able to then accelerate delivery and progress, and we're able to share information amongst ourselves. And then finally, we're really pleased to have the partners from OCP Africa showing the public-private partnership. It gives more potential for the scaling and innovation. And I would mention again that OCP Africa is deployed in all of these countries that we're talking about. And so that really is a great help to us too. I've come to the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanne. We now have time till 1 o'clock for questions online and in person. We do have a roamer with a microphone. Do we have questions in the room? Anoka?
Thank you. I'm Minoka Amrakon. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science. Thank you for your talk, Joanne. Very interesting talk. And the question that I have been thinking through your talk is, I just came back from Sri Lanka, and I was in Sri Lanka in October too, and I was talking about soil health too. And lots of faculty and government bodies, they're all aware of soil health and importance and ecological systems and all that. But I felt like the producers, the farmers, didn't really have time to think about that. And I felt really silly, like I'm preaching with the wrong audience. And so what is the general understanding or the acceptance or the knowledge about soil health of the producers in the area? And also, if you were to increase awareness or take it seriously, what would you do?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that's a great question. We, I think we're preaching to the converted here in this room. I think if I asked any one of you, think soil health is important? Oh, yes, it's really important. But you might go farther away and people say, what are you talking about? And so in Africa, the situation is actually quite simple, because we know that by improving the soil management and by doing simple things such as adjusting pH, by increasing soil organic matter and other things that we know are positive for soil health, we will actually see visible gains in yield. And that speaks volumes, because more yields is more money. Yes, it's more market, it's more opportunities. So we are in a situation in which we can kind of sell it in this direction. If it's not yield, meaning more, what else could it be? It can be quality. It can be nutrition. But what does that require? And it might require, just as we notice for some crops in Canada, that having a better, say, protein content or more starch or other things get you a premium price for that product. It might be that some market forces can be interesting to help encourage people. If you can show the connection between something about the soil and something that's of value to the farmer, I think they will be sold pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Crystal?
Okay, so we have a question from the online audience. By the way, the online audience is at about 130 watching us. So the question is, you talked about the use of AI, but I'm wondering about issues of data privacy, ownership, and control. Can you discuss?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what we have agreed upon for the data repositories is that those are open access data. And the reason why they can be open access data is because the data that we have to power them from the beginning is all publicly accessible. It has come from the published reports and it's in the public domain already. Now, we agree that there may be some issues at some point in time in which countries or individuals want to have their own sorts of private data. That would be up to them. So we would have to have some agreement about this. But for the present moment, the data that we're using is the publicly available data that can be considered in the public domain and is available as open access data.
Questions, Alistair?
I have a big mouth, but
I need it for online.
sorry.
We need the mic for online.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Whalen. My question, I come from sort of a different analogy, if I want to use Canada as a comparison in terms of Indigenous knowledge or thinking about traditional and verbal or written knowledge as it's passed down through the generations. What were they doing sort of prior to this idea of creating a hub to have this repository to be able to share information and see quality and quantity and be able to get that organic feedback as to how to change your inputs and your services? And at the same time, I might be missing something, but is it due to internal conflict and having huge generational shifts and that lack of what they've been doing traditionally that would benefit those areas as they currently exist as opposed to changing the inputs? So I don't know if you can comment on that.
Thank you so much. I think it's a question of maybe at several levels. The data that we have from countries normally comes through ministries of agriculture, through government bodies. And so that's how we would know about what the average yield of a crop is in a particular country or what the yield gap is and so on. On the farm scale, at the farm level, farmers tend to be conservative. We could say that. I think that's a general rule. And what I've noticed in some regions of Africa is that the farmers are quite astute as to the actual conditions, and they know that in some years, because they either know or sense that it's going to be a dry year through their indigenous knowledge or through what was passed down to them, they might say, because we're going to lack water this year, then we will not do a particular practice because it won't make a difference. But they also are conservative in the fact that if they try a fertilizer and it doesn't work for them as it's promised or expected according to what the seller is telling them, they might not be convinced to try it again because it is an extra cost, it's an extra step, it's extra. And we noticed in some regions where, for instance, pH or organic matter is a limitation, we might not see fertilizer responses. So that's why we're trying to take an approach of the integrated soil fertility management, in which we say it's not just fertilizer. There's several things that have to be handled, whether it be water, too much or too little, or whether it be pH or organic matter, or there may be, inoculants or whatever. We have to take account of those. We have to take account.
Crystal?
We have another one. Have you heard of African improved foods in Rwanda? Is it a good model?
So I have not, we're not working in Rwanda, and I'm not familiar with that. So I can't actually make a comment on that. And because I don't have an opportunity to get the input, I'll have to set the question aside.
Other questions from the House? Question, Joanne, with all your working in West Africa, what has surprised you the most?
What has surprised me the most about working in West Africa is actually how willing people are to get involved, which is a bit of a surprise because sometimes we have this notion that the reason that we're not working together is because they don't like to work together or they're not willing to work together. But in fact, I've noticed exactly the opposite. People love to work together. They want to work together. So there's always this great willingness to get together and to share a lot of knowledge. And so that's one of the things that I think makes this hub very exciting and interesting to work in, is that every time that we meet, there's this stories are shared and so on. And the communications are trying to take advantage of that. And just at our last meeting, they were asking us to share some success stories, or even if it's a little success, share them with us so that they can then further publicize them, because it creates interest and it creates engagement. And so that's what we're trying to do. So that's a very nice thing that I've noticed, is willingness and interest.
Yeah, that's great. So creating that structure,
Yeah.
that organization to facilitate that,
Yeah.
right? Is
Exactly.
very good. Okay, is there any? Yes, please.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. I just had a couple kind of questions on comments. It seemed like a lot of these solutions are very kind of input oriented around fertilizer and liming, which is seemingly a large constraint in the area. But I was just wondering if you had comments on, like, in a subsistence farmer context where they might have limited financial means to purchase these inputs. How does that interact with that solution, and kind of what can be done to facilitate access to those inputs when these farmers aren't really generating income from their farm?
Yeah, and so what we've noticed, and to try to help people to feel less alone and less prone to take that risk, because obviously what you're talking about is a kind of a risk management situation. Another thing that's going on in parallel to what we're doing is farmer associations. And so getting people kind of grouping together to support each other and even teach each other and model to others is been a thing that's been very, very helpful indeed. And so they talk about, going into areas, and then you would try to find or identify kind of who's the leading farmer in this area and get them involved in this awareness program, and demonstrate on their farm the utility of certain inputs and show what the outcomes could be to encourage others in such a way. So, and again, it's not all about inputs. Some things are actually very simple, like stopping soil erosion, because that's another thing that can be a barrier to good yields. The soil kind of floats away. So some of these things are very low-tech solutions that can be implemented, that we bundle together as what we call, like, just as a soil management, soil conservation practice. So I hope that also helps.
Great. Well, this brings us to the end of today's or this year's Poyser lecture. I'd like to please join me in thanking Dr. Whalen for sharing her experience and expertise with us. Thanks, Joanne. For those online with the Canadian Sustainability Agriculture Conference, you're joining right now back into the conference for 1 p.m. And thank you very much. And we'll see you again. Looking forward to seeing you again next year for the 2027 Poyser lecture.